Tensions in Ukraine are spreading from the southern Crimean peninsula to other parts of the country. Pro-Russian protesters have occupied parts of a government building in the eastern city of Donetsk and stormed the provincial council in the southern city of Odessa. Russia has denied reports that it's issued an ultimatum to Ukrainian forces in Crimea to surrender or face an attack. The US says it will consider all options if Russian forces refuse to withdraw. Is there still room for a diplomatic solution, or is a military confrontation inevitable? How far are Moscow and the US willing to go as the crisis unfolds? And will Ukraine survive the escalating crisis or lose its territorial integrity? I'm Homa Lesgi, and you're watching The Debate. Joining us now live from Los Angeles, is author and filmmaker Mr. SASHA KNEZEV, whose latest documentary film is called American Addict, and senior fellow with the Center for American Progress and a former Assistant U.S. Secretary of Defense, Mr. Lawrence Korb, is with us live from Washington. Welcome, both of you, to this program, this edition of The Debate. I'll put my first question to our guest in Los Angeles, Mr. KNEZEV. Tensions in Ukraine are spreading to the southern Crimean Peninsula and now to the eastern parts of the country. Do you think Ukraine will preserve its territorial integrity, or will it break up into smaller countries, as a lot of people are now worried about?
Well, to begin with, I'd like to say that I feel incredibly sorry for the people of Ukraine. I believe they are the victims of a geopolitical game between the West and the East. And that being said, I'd like to give a brief history of the Crimean area before we get into put that within the framework of what's going on presently in Ukraine. Nikita Khrushchev in 1954 gave the Crimea to the Ukraine as sort of a symbolic gesture, though it has historically been Russian. Nearly 48% of the population there is Russian. They're Russian speaking, and they identify themselves as being Russian. That being said, this is of major strategic importance for the Russians, not only because of their pipeline that runs through Crimea that supplies 25% of Western Europe with natural gas, but also because of their naval base. I think there's so many layers to this, but to begin with, I like to say that the pretext of being overthrowing of these so-called revolutions that are being fabricated by the West and being funded by the West should be really looked at carefully. I mean, this Orange Revolution that was conducted in 2005, that was fully supported by the United States State Department and the West, the UK was heavily involved. They immediately put in somebody by the name of Yulia Tymoshenko, who was convicted in 2011, I believe, of embezzling something like $200 million. She was an asset of the West, and she privatized over 300 industries for the Ukraine. She was, in 2005, voted the, I believe, third most powerful woman by Forbes magazine. So there's several layers to this, but I'd like to just, putting into context the fact that the United States is, using this term invasion when we are actually funding the people involved and putting in unseating democratically elected officials. So we'll leave it at that.
Well, you raised a couple of issues there, but I'll start with one of them and put this next question to Mr. Korb in Washington. Mr. Korb, what do you think about the nature of what's being called the revolution in Ukraine? Because the ousted president, Viktor Yanukovych, said in Russia that an agreement was reached, and that agreement was meant to resolve the crisis. And in that agreement, elections were going to be held and a new government would be set in. But he said immediately after that agreement was signed, people started to invade government buildings, started taking over government institutions, and there was complete chaos. And he was saying that the EU ministers who were present during that agreement and the opposition had betrayed him. So what do you think about the reasons behind the failure of that agreement and also the amount of support that the opposition got from the West? But it looks like we've got a technical problem there. We can't hear Mr. Korb with us. He is in Washington. We'll try to bring him back, though, just as soon as we can. We'll try to resolve that technical glitch. But I'll put this next question to our guest in Los Angeles, Mr. Knezev, before we get Mr. Korb back. Now, Mr. Knezev, you were saying there that you think the revolution cannot be called as such a genuine revolutionary movement because you were suggesting there that there's been a lot of interference involved. But let's look at the question of Russia here. Why has Russia in this situation taken a military approach? How valid do you find the concerns that this military approach is threatening the territorial integrity of Ukraine?
Well, this is this is vital for Russia. In essence, they have to react. They cannot, if they do not react, Russia as a power could be finished. I mean, the Ukraine joining NATO and enveloping Russia is exactly what Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote about in his book, The Grand Chessboard. He talked about Eurasia, conquering Eurasia. So Russia has no choice. I mean, if they let go of the Crimea, they're done. They're not going to give. They're not going to give Crimea up. They just can't. They can't afford it militarily. They can't afford it economically. The pipeline that runs through Crimea up through Western Europe is responsible for 25% of the gas outlet for Western Europe. It's vital economically and it's vital militarily. So Russia is not going to give it up. I think it's insanity on the part of our administration to even suggest that they would. And I fear an escalation as the result of that. China has openly come out today and say that they are in agreement with Russia. So where's that leading us to? The grand chessboard, as Brzezinski called it. Are we looking towards an Eastern-Western clash? And as a result, how many civilians are going to suffer?
Well, hopefully Mr. Korb is back with us now and his audio problem has been resolved. Mr. Korb, the question that we raised earlier, I'd like you to answer that question first before we move on.
Well, I think, the issue was right. There was an agreement that was brokered by the European countries, and they were going to have an election within a year. But the Ukrainian people were not happy with the president, and they did not like the agreement, and so they protested. Then he left the country, and now we have an interim government that's going to be there until we can have elections. But this was the Ukrainian people, particularly in the western part of the country, were not happy with the agreement.
Well, that's the question, isn't it? While those who do support the current government in Ukraine or Kiev say that the people didn't want the president to remain in the country, the president himself and others say, well, that agreement was about, a transfer of power and was going to settle this crisis without things getting out of control. So some people are asking that couldn't we say that the EU or Washington is just stepping outside of its normal red lines, because they're asking what was the German foreign minister, for instance, doing in the streets of Kiev during the protests? What was John McCain doing there, Victoria Nuland doing there? What was the agenda that they were pursuing? And couldn't this be described as interference, too much involvement?
Do you want me to answer that?
I think what they were saying...
that question to Mr. Korb.
...was that... Okay. I think what people were saying, like the German foreign minister, that Mr. Yanukovych was so corrupt he didn't even have the right to stay any longer, and so he left. And then we found out the luxurious lifestyle that he had been living. And Senator McCain was not there. Senator McCain is not part of the government. He's just a senator. And I think they were speaking out against the obvious corruption of Mr. Yanukovych. But this was a spontaneous uprising. It had nothing to do. Nobody in the West was pushing it. In fact, the West, particularly the Europeans, would have wanted to have this stability until you could have an election.
And now, Mr. Knezev, what's your reaction to that? Do you think that this couldn't be described as intervention?
Yanukovych won 48% of the vote in 2010. He was elected. In this country, in the United States, Obama has something like I think a 40% approval rating. So most of the country is dissatisfied with what he's doing. Does that mean we're going to throw him out of office? Absolutely not. So I'd like to state that that's the first point I'd like to make. The second point is, here in the West, we like to use the term democracy and state that, these people that are being elected are serving the democratic purpose and serving the voice of the people. But then we have situations like in 2011, where the democratically elected prime minister of Italy was thrown out and replaced. This was during the entire austerity scenario within the EU and Italy's debt and its tackling of the IMF and whatnot. A man by the name of Mario Monti was replaced, and he wasn't even elected inside. He was called a technocrat. That's a Western term for somebody that serves the interests of Western financial institutions. Mario Monti was an international advisor for Goldman Sachs, and he was put in as a technocrat. Again, the term technocrat is somebody that is able to deal with an economic crisis. Has nothing to do with being elected in office. The same scenario played out with Papadimos in Greece. He was a Federal Reserve banker in Boston. He replaced the democratically elected prime minister in Greece when Greece was under its current IMF austerity measures, when the people were rioting, when people were very much against joining the remaining a part of the EU. They wanted out of the EU. He was also called a technocrat. So I think these are very clever games and words that the West likes to use. And I am an American. I think that we need to concentrate on problems we have at home. We have a tremendous unemployment rate. People here are suffering incredibly. And, we have college students that cannot get a job after school. We have healthcare issues. We have infrastructure that needs to be addressed, healthcare. We need to take the $4 to $6 trillion invested in defense over the last 11 or 12 years and reinvest that into our country to address our issues. So, the term democratically elected varies, and it's a very sensitive issue.
Mr. Korb, we've got the U.S. Secretary of State now saying that all options are going to be on the table against Russia if it refuses to withdraw its troops from the country. A lot of people are now seeing this as a revival even of the Cold War era, and they're saying that Ukraine is now the new battlefield between Russia and the US. Do you think it's going to be as serious as that? How far do you think Washington or Russia may go?
Well, it's not the new Cold War. And basically what's going to happen is the international community, not just the United States, is going to take economic sanctions against Russia for violating the agreement they signed in 1994 in Budapest, saying they would not interfere in Ukrainians' internal affairs if Ukrainian gave them back all the nuclear weapons that they had on their soil. And I think that's what's going to happen. People have talked about not having the G8 meeting in Sochi. And this is very similar to what happened back in 2008 when Russia actually sent troops into Georgia and annexed 2 provinces of Georgia. Back then, the economic sanctions didn't work as much because the price of oil was higher and the Russian economy was better. These sanctions are going to hurt the Russian people because the ruble is already very, very, very low.
And Mr. Knezev, do you agree with that? Or do you think the Western options now against Russia are in fact limited or ineffective? I mean, economic sanctions or what was mentioned there, the refusal or the boycott of the G8 meeting in Sochi. Do you think these are effective measures?
Well, I'd like to address the issue of violating UN resolutions. The United States in early 2000 violated UN Resolution 1266, which seceded Kosovo from the then independent sovereign state of Yugoslavia. So that was a direct violation. Russia is looking at that as a paradigm, as a paradox to what is going on, and they like to bring up that issue. And the United States, in the aftermath, has built a giant military base called Bondsteel in Kosovo. So we need to put history into perspective. The United States violated UN Resolution 1266. So now Mr. Korb is saying that Russia is violating UN resolutions. But when the U.S. set the precedent in the early 2000s with Yugoslavia, how can that be justified? Going back to what I was stating earlier also about these central bankers assuming the role of prime minister, that's exactly what happened in the Ukraine. The current Ukrainian prime minister is, lo and behold, a former central banker. So this issue is all about finance. It's all about transnational corporations, and most notably about natural resources. The Ukraine is a tremendous producer of grain. I believe in 2000 they were the third or fourth producer of grain. They are the breadbasket of Europe. It also has to do with energy pipelines. So there's several layers to this, but that's my reference to the UN resolution being violated.
Mr. Korb, with President Yanukovych gone, a lot of people first saw this as a victory for the opposition. A new government was created. But now, looking at the situation in Crimea, and now that situation spreading to other cities in the east and south of Ukraine, do you think that this was something that's going to turn the tables, something that wasn't predicted by the opposition or its Western backers, that these people in Crimea specifically coming out, protesting, saying that they want Russian help, saying that they feel safe and secure with Russian troops, and saying that we want even more autonomy?
Well, I think that Crimea is basically a semi-autonomous republic in Ukraine. They've been pretty much making their own decisions. I don't think the fact that Mr. Yanukovych left the country had anything to do with it. I think the whole question was he was going to be replaced, and they were concerned that the next leader would not be as amenable to their interests as Mr. Yanukovych was. So no, I don't think so. I think, basically, if you take a look at it, Russian troops were already in there even before President Putin got permission from the Russian parliament to do it and denied that they were there. They were wearing uniforms that didn't have Russian insignia on, but they were there. They've got their Black Sea fleet is already there. So no, I don't think. I think the real question was when the end of the Yanukovych regime came, whether it's now or a couple of months, that was the catalyst for the people in Ukraine being concerned about the next leader, whatever he or she might do.
Mr. Knezev, do you think then that there shouldn't be any concerns then that Crimea is going to be separated from Ukraine as a whole?
Absolutely, there should be concern, and I guess I want to stress that my condolences go out to the Ukrainian people. They are the victims of this, much like the people of the former Yugoslavia were victims of the war back then, when the NATO and the IMF came in, ripped the country up, took all the natural resources, indebted themselves, and the people are the ones that ultimately suffer. Look, I don't think that Putin is a Boy Scout, with the exception of Crimea, which is a vital interest for the Russians. Putin is not invading other countries. He's not, overthrowing other countries, which is something, unfortunately, I cannot say for our government. Where do we begin? Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. The list goes on. And as far as bringing democracy to the Middle East or to Eurasia or to the East, I would like to say, why is there a virtual Western media silence in what's going on in Bahrain? They're writing in Bahrain on a weekly, monthly basis. But Bahrain is an ally of the West, so we don't hear that on our news coverage. Also, I would like to say the same about Saudi Arabia. You want to talk about human rights abuses. I mean, I think the epitome is Saudi Arabia, but of course, them being a strategic ally, we don't mention that. So this, facade of bringing democracy and free elections to the Middle East, it's something that unfortunately is not true. We live in a world where we need to be savvy to what geopolitics means. So it's up to the American people to educate themselves and to look past, what's going on in our culture and look beyond the borders of our culture. So 70% of Americans don't even have passports. They couldn't pin Ukraine to a map. So unfortunately, it's a matter of us getting educated to how the world really works.
Well, we are quickly running out of time. I'd like both of you to give your concluding remarks. I'll start with Mr. Korb in Washington. Mr. Korb, what do you think the future holds now for Ukraine? Do you think that a political resolution of the current crisis is possible? Do you think that even the agreement that was reached earlier on with Yanukovych can work, or that's out of the question? Or do you think things are going to escalate to a military level?
Well, I hope not. I don't think it will, because basically I don't think Russia wants to control all of Ukraine, given their economic problems. That's an economic basket case, and to take that over would make the problems in Russia even greater. I think what the Russians want to ensure is that their access to their Black Sea fleet remains the way it is. And keep in mind that the West has other things that they're working with Russia on, eliminating nuclear weapons, the sanctions against Iran, and trying to work out an agreement in Syria. So this is not the only thing that we're working with the Russians on.
And Mr. Knezev, what do you think the future holds? Do you think that a military escalation is out of the question? Do you think a political settlement is possible now?
I pray for peace. I certainly hope there's no military escalation. It's really up to the administration. I'm optimistic. I remain optimistic, and I sincerely believe that we can get out of this. And again, I want to stress the issue that we need to stop tangling in foreign affairs, and we need to address the issue here, the domestic issues at home. We have several issues to address here in the United States, and we need to help our citizens. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Author and filmmaker Mr. SASHA KNEZEV in Los Angeles, again, whose latest documentary film is called American Addict. And a big thank you to our guest in Washington, Mr. Lawrence Korb, Senior Fellow with the Center for American Progress and a former Assistant U.S. Secretary of Defense. Thank you so much, everyone, for staying with us here on The Debate.